Hollywood Taxidermy. Hey, let's buy that IP, kill it, skin it, stuff it with whatever we like. Is it moral or immoral? That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. So, at long last, we have our episode on Hollywood Taxidermy. Now, those of you who follow this channel regularly, you've already heard this term. We talked about it when I was talking about the Netflix Mary movie. So you can go back and give that one a listen and see what that's all about. But it was in that episode that I introduced my preferred term for this practice in Hollywood, what I've called Hollywood Taxidermy, where you take something like an IP, like Tolkien or whatever, you take it, it's alive, it's thriving, you take it, you kill it, you gut it, you stuff it with whatever you want, and then you try to sell it to people as the original thing. Taxidermy, right? And this is Hollywood Taxidermy. So obviously, I presume most folks are aware of exactly what I'm talking about. This is the sort of thing that Hollywood tends to do quite often these days. So if you look at the history of Hollywood, there's always been sort of an ebb and flow where everybody in town, so to speak, starts to do all the same things, right? Like musicals are hot, so now we're going to do all musicals. When Star Wars came out, sci-fi is hot, we've got to do all sci-fi, right? That sort of thing. And right now we're in the era of IP. Meaning Hollywood is struggling to come up with its own original content. And so what's the latest novel that's selling well? Let's buy that and turn it into a movie. What's some book series that was hot that we can do? And then also, let's just dust off a bunch of old stuff. What's a bunch of 80s like shows or action figures or board games or whatever that we can repurpose, we can reboot, right? What's some IP out there that was really successful that we can buy and now remake and so on. And obviously the way that Hollywood has started to handle that material has met with a fair bit of discontent of late. Now, I don't mean the usual like, oh, I wanted the movie to be great and it wasn't that great. I mean, that happens, right? Obviously that that was something when I was growing up as a kid. It was, you always knew that there was going to be something like, oh, did you know that they're going to turn that book into a movie, right? And something like Little Women or something like that. This is back in the Winona Ryder days or something. And you watch that and you're like, oh yeah, it was pretty good, but the book was better, right? You always had that kind of response, that there was always the book is better crowd, and obviously that's understandable, right? Where you're saying like, look, they took the book, they tried to adapt it into a movie. I thought it was all right. It wasn't bad. I think, for example, of Narnia. So I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis. Anybody who listens to this podcast knows that. And I've talked about in a different episode. Was it actually? Maybe it was. I think it was the Hollywood Taxidermy episode. I talked about one of the reasons why it's very difficult to adapt Lewis in a way that captures what's really magical about Lewis. But that's the sort of thing where like, yeah, there's decisions in that movie that I disagree with in terms of how they handled it. But overall, I didn't look at, the Narnia movie, the first one, at least, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and say like, oh, they're trying to do something corruptive, right? They're trying to violate Lewis's corpse here or something like that. That is not what came through. It was just like, yeah, it's all right. The book's better, right? And you had plenty of that, right? That's what most people, at least when I was growing up, that was what most people kind of expected, right? The film adaptation of the movie is going to fall short of the magic of the book. But more recently, in more recent years, you started to see a different sort of trend taking place, which is that it seemed like Hollywood was actually doing something rather different. It wasn't just that they were falling short of the magic of the original IP. It's that they were taking the IP and they were doing something to it where they were using it essentially as a Trojan horse, right? They wanted to say something about this political issue or this social issue or something like that. And they wanted to tell a certain type of story and they wanted to introduce certain types of characters, but none of that stuff was in the original story. None of that stuff was in the original IP. And so what they were doing is they were essentially buying an IP and then gutting it and then stuffing in, their own stuff. And this is where you started to see actually crowd outrage at this sort of thing when people would look at this and they go, this IP is, sacred to us. And what have you done to it, right? You haven't just failed to live up to the magic of it, but you've actually in some ways turned it into some sort of monstrosity that I don't recognize. You've inserted into it an alien worldview. You've inserted into it new characters. You've violated some of the other characters and so on. And we see a number of examples of this. One of the examples is the MCU. So if you haven't heard that term, the MCU is one that's been popularized on YouTube by a lot of outrage fans who are upset about the way in which the Marvel movies started handling. I believe it was like Marvel Phase 4 or Phase 3? I forget where. I think it was Marvel Phase 4 anyway, where they started to basically swap out all the male characters for female characters. So all of a sudden, just as an example, we're going to do a show called Arrow. And you're excited about Arrow because you know the superhero Arrow, and you've seen the Avenger movie, so you know actually the actor and the character Arrow, and you see him in the trailer, so you're like, cool, we're getting a whole show about Arrow. And then before you know it, you're like, wait a second. This show isn't about Arrow. This is a show about how Arrow is washed up, and it's really a show about some girl who is better than Arrow at, the whole Arrow thing, and how he's supposed to basically genuflect to her and pass along the gauntlet, pass along his mantle to her and say, yeah, you're better than I ever was, and so on. And we're supposed to basically abandon the Arrow that we expected, that we wanted, and embrace this alternative female version.
Hey, Nathan Jacobs jumping in here on the edit. I know. It's Hawkeye, not Arrow. My apologies to all the MCU fans. Okay. Now back to the podcast.
And the MCU did that a lot, where they started to, at some point, just sort of gender swap characters and try to get rid of all the male characters, and not just get rid of the male characters, but in many ways subvert and subjugate and humiliate and send off to the off stage the characters that you've come to know and love, and instead embrace these sort of female counterparts of them. Anyway, that's an example of one where folks are like, I think I'm being sold a false bill of goods, right? I got into this expecting the Marvel universe, and now I'm getting some other sort of fabricated universe that isn't what I wanted. I thought I was getting Marvel, and now we've got this other thing. So you had that sort of thing. Obviously, Rings of Power, you had this similar sort of thing happen, where there was a world of a difference between the way somebody like Peter Jackson had handled the IP of Tolkien, and then all of a sudden the way in which Amazon came along and launched Rings of Power, and the writers on that seemed to basically buy a lot of Tolkien's sort of IP and try to build this sort of like prequel type world, which Tolkien actually had developed that lore as well. But they were really sort of violating a lot of it in terms of the timelines, in terms of the characters, in terms of who's important and who's not, and so on. And everybody smelled in that a lot of political agenda about like feminism and whatever else. And so a lot of people were outraged, right? That this is violative of Tolkien's world. You see the same thing with the more recent cartoon War of the Rohirrim. You might not have heard that because it really bombed, but it was a cartoon version about, the War of the Rohirrim. And so here we're going to get, the people of Rohan, we're going to get the background lore there. But at the same time, it's like, okay, but the central character is this one character that's not important in Tolkien's lore, who's not even named. Of course, it's a female who is stronger and smarter and wiser than all the males. And all the folly that happens is because the males didn't listen to her and so on. And we have to like actually give her a name because she was so insignificant in Tolkien's real lore that we don't even know her name. And so you have like those sorts of examples there, and we could go on, and I'll talk about some of these as we move forward, right? There's worries that are percolating about things that are on the horizon. So HBO is redoing the Harry Potter series, and there's a lot of question marks like, oh, what are they going to do to it? There's been rumors about the fact that Netflix is planning on doing a whole bunch of C.S. Lewis stuff, and I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, I believe Greta Gerwig is the one that they've put in charge of it, which, needless to say, people like myself go, there are some pretty significant worldview differences between C.S. Lewis, who is not at all a feminist, and Greta. And I have a suspicion that Greta is not going to put aside her own ideology and do Lewis's world. I have a feeling we're going to get Greta's sort of taxidermy version of C.S. Lewis. So anyway, this has become the trend that's very different than the older trend of like, well, the book is better, meaning, like, yeah, they tried to adapt the book, but, you just can't capture that magic. And so it falls short. This is something else, right? This is something else. And this something else is the thing that I've dubbed Hollywood taxidermy, where what you're really doing is you're saying, look, we're going to buy that. And we're going to buy that because it has an audience that wants it. Now, we're not interested in that in the full sense, in the true sense, in the living, breathing sense. We're just interested in the utility of the skin to sell tickets, to sell it to an audience. And that's why we're going to buy it and then kill it and skin it. And then we're going to stuff it with characters, stories, ideology, worldview, agenda that we want because we own it. And the question that I want to look at today is that moral or is it immoral? Now, the reason I raise that question is because obviously the ways in which fans react, it seems to have this certain moral undercurrent, right? It's not just that they're disappointed. They in some ways feel violated. So if you wade into the waters of like super fans on a certain IP, right? People who love Tolkien, and then they look at what Rings of Power did, it's outrage, right? It's actual like outrage. And the outrage isn't just like, oh man, I'm disappointed. I was hoping the movie was going to be better, right? The outrage seems to be indicative of a tacit sense that somehow they have been wronged. Somehow Tolkien has been wronged. Somehow there is some kind of injustice or immorality that has transpired here that is worthy of outrage. It's not just the usual, no, I like the book better sort of stuff. It doesn't have that air of indifference. It has that air of morality. And so I want to look at the question of like, why is that? Because I think there actually is an instinct underneath that outrage that says, yeah, there's something unjust. There's something wrong. There's something immoral here. And I think that's actually legitimate. So that's what we're going to explore today here on the podcast. Okay, now, in order to explore this topic properly, we're going to wade into certain overlapping territories, right? On the one hand, there's like these legal questions of, does a person have a legal right to do this sort of thing? And then there's this question of sort of more natural or moral questions, right? One of those is rights, right? So does a person have a right to do this sort of thing or not? And that's where you sort of get this intersection between legality and morality. Because on the one hand, it's possible that a person has a legal right to do a thing. And yet rights, if you're a naturalist with regard to rights, and I'll talk about what that is, if you have a natural view of rights, then rights also start to intersect with morality. But obviously not all things that are immoral are also illegal, right? And not all things that are legal are moral, right? So there's this sort of, you have to differentiate what is legal and what is legally permissible, what a person can do versus the sort of moral question of what a person ought to do. And so I want to talk a little bit about this sort of thing, right? About the concept of rights and the intersection between rights and morality, because this goes right to the heart of the sorts of things that we're looking at here with the question of intellectual property. So let's start by just touching on rights. And by the way, I do an episode that has been underappreciated, I will say, is actually my episode on cultural appropriation, right? On the cultural appropriation of language, right? And whether it's immoral for another people to sort of appropriate another people groups language, for example. And so that's an interesting episode. And in that episode, if you're interested in these sorts of discussions about like rights and natural rights and the intersections with duties and obligations and morality and things like that, you'll probably enjoy that episode. So I'm sure we'll link to that below. But when it comes to rights, there are really sort of in modernity, you get sort of two views of rights, right? The one view of rights is a realist view of rights, and the other is a nominalist view of rights. And so this is typically differentiated as the difference between, say, a natural view of rights and a positivist view of rights. So what's the difference? So a natural view of rights suggests that somehow rights are real features of reality. They're general, genuine relational properties in reality that come with certain obligations and certain duties, and in this sense, rights. So when we talk about parental rights, or we talk about the right of, the right to property, or whatever it is, you're talking about certain grounded, real relations in reality. Whereas the alternative is a positivist view of right. And that positivist view of right says, like, no, rights are all just mental fictions. Those sorts of relational properties are mental inventions. And therefore, when we talk about rights, these are just sort of social constructs, right? These are things that we come up with. Maybe we come up with them governmentally, for example. And then these sort of invented fictions end up being imposed, by force by the government. Okay, so this is normally traced to two figures in modernity, the figure of John Locke on the one hand, and the figure of Thomas Hobbes on the other. So John Locke is a realist with regard to rights. He believes, for example, that that the fact that my children are my direct offspring means that my relationship to them carries certain both obligations, right? I am duty bound to them as my offspring to provide for them and care for them and raise them in the way they should go, as well as certain rights to do that, right? So the government can't just come in and take my children away from me. They really do belong to me in a certain way, not as property, the way you might own a book that you've purchased or something like that. But there is a real tether between me and them that is meaningful and real, that's there in reality, that when you're talking about my duties as a parent, you're talking about something meaningful and real. That's not a mental fiction. When you're talking about my obligations to them, that's something meaningful and real. And also, if you're going to talk about, certain moral obligations like to honor your father and mother, those are also then real relational properties, right? Those are real duties that adhere to them, right? So there's certain moral duties. This was something very clear in the ancient world. The idea that the firstborn child has certain, rights. The idea that parents have certain duties to their parents and their parents to the children, and that these are all descriptive of actual features of nature given those real relational properties. So if you think in those sorts of terms, then what you're talking about is you're talking about a natural view of rights. You actually think that reality includes certain structures that come with duties and obligations and things like that. So if you have that view, right, that you are talking about, well, reality carries certain real relations, right, for example, between parents and children, then you are talking about, obligations, duties, all the rest, in this sense, rights. Then you have a natural view of rights, right? You understand when talking about parental rights, the parental right to, make decisions about their children and guide them forward and things like that. Then if you understand that to be actually part of the order of nature and indicative of real relational properties, then you have a natural view of rights. And that's the sort of view of rights that somebody like John Locke had. Now, the contrast with this is Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes is a positivist with regards to rights, that basically he suggests, like, no, rights, there's no such thing as these sort of relational properties. Now, keep in mind, Hobbes is an empiricist. So when he's talking about this sort of a natural outgrowth of his empiricist nominalism, where he presumes that, like, no, those sorts of mental associations you're talking about there, between people and the things that they create, or, property that they work on, or, money that they've earned or whatever, these sorts of relational properties in reality, right? The empirical reality is that there is no tether between them and that. And so we can sort of talk about these mental associations that we have, but there's no real sort of in nature. There is no right there to be spoken of. And instead, what Hobbes suggests is that the only real right is the right to whatever you can take. So Hobbes takes a very bleak view of the world and of morality and of government and things like that. Basically, think of The Walking Dead, right? So any sort of post-apocalyptic scenario where all government falls away and all of a sudden people are left in a power struggle, that's basically Hobbes's world, right? That's what he thinks is the state of nature. And so under the state of nature, he says, look, the only right is the right to what you can take. If I can take your stuff, then it belongs to me. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me. If I can take your property, it belongs to me. If I can take your kids, they belong to me. Hobbes even says, if I can take your body, it belongs to me. Right. So it's a very bleak view where basically rights just describe what you can take. Right. The natural right, the only right that is there in nature is that whatever you are strong enough to grab hold of and to hold on to and protect is yours, right? That's the sort of natural view of rights. Now, Hobbes recognizes, though, like nobody wants to live that way, right? I don't want to live where I'm perpetually worrying that somebody's going to break into my house and take my stuff or kidnap my kids or whatever it might be. Nobody wants to live that way. And so this is where Hobbes suggests that what we have is we have social contracts. And the social contracts are basically a way of trying to create a more sort of orderly society in the face of the state of nature, which we don't want. And that more orderly society based on contract is to say, look, you don't want to be worrying about whether I'm going to break into your house. I don't want to be worrying about whether you're going to break into my house. So let's just do a social contract. We're going to agree that we'll lay down our arms and we'll agree to this whole thing, that I won't trample on your flowers. If you don't trample on my flowers, we're good to go. And now we can all sleep at night without worrying about that sort of thing. Now, Hobbes recognizes you still have this trust issue. Like, well, can I actually trust that you're going to follow through on that contract? And that's why Hobbes says that's why you need a sovereign, and preferably a big, strong, scary sovereign, right? This is where like Hobbes's ideal form of government is one that is very intimidating. And why? Well, because if my neighbor doesn't think that the government might come in and put the smackdown on him for breaking into my house, if he thinks he can get away with it, then we still sort of leave cracks in the system for that agreement, that social contract, to be void, basically, and worthless. In order for it to be of value, I have to be afraid of the sovereign who is enforcing the contract, right? And that's how Hobbes sees the government, right? The primary role of the government is to be the contract enforcer. And that's why it's really important that they're big and scary and intimidating so that people abide by the contract because they're worried about the consequences. Now, on that view, now you have what's called a positivist view of rights. The positivist view is basically saying, like, we can come up with whatever rights we want because they're just inventions. They're just sort of the terms of the contract. So if it came about, right, for example, we said there's a right to free college. Well, as long as the government is willing to instill that right and enforce that right, well, then it exists, right? But we're not referring to some sort of feature of reality that somehow there's a relational property between me as a human being and this institution called a college where I have a right to go there and not pay tuition. Right. Like he's like, there's no sort of relational property in reality I can point to for that. And we can't even talk about the government sort of failing to give you that right if that's not currently the situation. Like the fact of the matter is, if that's not currently the situation, you don't have that right. But you could jockey to have that right. You could say, well, look, I want a right to free college. And in this sense, if the government follows through, now you have it. And then if they revoke it, you don't have it. So this is sort of the thing about a positivist view of rights, is that rights really just are whatever the government grants you. And so in this sense, you end up in this scenario where you can't really talk about the government violating your rights. You could talk about the government failing to enforce your rights, right? You know, that I have a right to own property and somebody else came along and they took it from me and the government fails to like give it back to me or something like that. That would be a failure of the government to follow through on some sort of agreement. You could talk about that. You could talk about contradicting rights, right? Where there's something that the government has promised you over here, and they've run into conflict. And so there's some sort of like, principle that's violating another principle. You could talk about that. But you couldn't talk about rights that you have that are not acknowledged by the government if you're a positivist about rights. Because the only rights you have are those that are granted you by the government. Now, I say this because this is rather important because just as an aside, not that we're talking specifically about the U.S. Constitution today or anything like that, But U.S. government actually was predicated on a natural view of rights. It's very clear that that is the sort of founding principle. So the talk of inalienable rights, right, in the Declaration of Independence is very clearly a naturalist view of rights. And I believe it's the Ninth Amendment that actually, this is a very rough paraphrase, but it basically sits there and it says like, hey, the people have certain rights that are not here enumerated, and they retain those rights. And so the only reason to include a clause like that is to say that you are not a positivist, right? So that is because a positivist can't talk about non-enumerated rights. The only rights you have are those that are enumerated. You have the rights that we've said you have, and that's it. And if we strike things from the list, you don't have them anymore. And if we add things to the list, you now have them. Only a natural view of rights can say that somehow in nature, I have certain rights. In nature, according to the order of nature, I have certain rights and duties and obligations with regard to my children, and the government may or may not align with those. And so that's actually very much the sort of founding vision with regard to the United States. The idea that there is this sort of natural law, natural order to things, real relational properties, and that's sort of like the order of nature over here. And then the laws that are enacted can either acknowledge that and map onto it. In this sense, they're just, or they can skew it, they can violate it. And in this sense, it becomes unjust. And that's an important part of the entire principle, the entire framework, of how U.S. constitutional government is at least instantiated. Whether or not people are actually thinking in those terms now would be a larger discussion. But at least let's just suffice it to say that that's what's in our founding documents, and very clearly what's there in the thinking of the founders, who were influenced by people like John Locke, as well as like the common law tradition and things like that. Now, there is an interesting oddity here, just by way of laying out this background. And that's that you would think, if you're familiar with this podcast and you're familiar with the extent to which we tend to talk about realism versus nominalism, you would naturally expect that John Locke, having a natural view of rights, advocating natural law, would be a realist, and Thomas Hobbes would be a nominalist. And obviously, I already touched on the nominalism and empiricism of Hobbes. Just for those who are not regular viewers and might be just tuning in for the first time here, let's do a little bit of a quick aside here on realism versus nominalism, which folks who listen regularly have heard ad nauseum. But here we go again. We can't be presumptuous with the listenership here. So realism is this philosophical question that begins with the observation that you and I and every other human being, we look out into the world and we think in terms of groups. We think in terms of genera, animal, species, human, common properties, bipedal. And the question of realism is those structures that the mind identifies. Are those real, right? Are they somehow a feature of reality that out there, in some sense, the world is structured in a way that reflects those properties, that those things the mind is identifying, it's identifying a real feature of reality. Reality has these structures in some way, shape, or form. If you answer yes, then you are a realist, right? Those are real features of reality. Those are real structures. Now, if you say like, no, those are mental fictions, all that stuff out there is just sort of random chaotic matter, but the mind needs to organize it in some way. And so that's why it comes up with a series of categories and groups in order to try to organize the otherwise chaotic stuff. And so it becomes a useful mental fiction by which to navigate otherwise disorganized reality, but that are mental fictions, right? These are just names that we're coming up with and projecting on reality, but out there, none of that structure is sort of like real. If you say that, then you're a nominalist, from the Latin nomen, right? These are just names. So I've talked about this being one of in our inaugural episode, I talked about how it's the most important question in the history of ideas in my assessment. And I went through how you could actually see the entire history of ideas all the way up to the sorts of discussions we're having in culture today as an extension of two roads, right? The realist road versus the nominalist road. And I've waded into any number of waters related to this. Obviously, I am a realist. Now, the reason I bring this up is because you would probably expect that anybody who's talking about natural law, anybody who's talking about real relational properties out there that ground morality and then also ground rights, duties, obligations, you would think, well, obviously, I mean, they've got to be a realist. And Hobbes, by contrast, the positivist view, makes sense that you would be a nominalist, because what you're saying is like, look, those sorts of relational properties that we talk about, the things that we're looking at when we talk about rights and duties and obligations, those are just mental fictions, right? Oh, yeah, that's nominalism. And indeed, it's true. Hobbes is a nominalist and an empiricist. And so his advocacy of a positivist view of rights makes total sense. No surprises there. The real surprise is actually that John Locke, too, is a nominalist. Now, I think the thing is, like, Locke was subject to intense critiques for this. Like, they didn't think, people like David Hume, didn't think that this talk of rights could actually hold ground if you're an empiricist. And I think he's quite right. So this is one of these sort of oddities about John Locke. There's a lot of people, when they talk about natural law, for example, there's usually two people who come up in their mind. The one is Thomas Aquinas, rightly so, and the other is John Locke. Maybe people might think of the Stoics as well. But obviously, there's a lot more advocates of natural law. Pretty much the entire Judeo-Christian tradition is a natural law advocate until you get into the late medieval scholastics, where you get divine command theory. But for most of Christian history and the mainstream of Christian history, all the way actually into the Protestant tradition, you have natural law as the standard Christian position. I think it's actually, what's the book by Grable? Is it Stephen Grable? Yeah, it's Stephen Grable. His book on rediscovering natural law in the Reformed tradition. It's actually rather embarrassing that I forgot his first name, given that I know Stephen. So, hey, Steve, it's been a minute. Anyway, so folks would typically either think of, like Thomas Aquinas or John Locke. Now, this is actually sort of a bit of an oddity in the sense that I don't think John Locke actually is a natural law ethicist. I mean, he is, but he's not. And what I mean by that is that natural law, in the sort of like traditional sense of the Stoics, and then into the Christian tradition and into people like Thomas Aquinas, right, that classical version of natural law actually is inherently realist in nature. So the traditional view of natural law actually suggests that things have an innate nature, right? A form or a nature, an essence. So the nature of human is something that I have. That structure that we identify, that form, that species that we identify is actually in some ways like in me, or I participate in it, depending on the form of realism you have. If you're a Platonist, it's, it's by imitation. If you're an Aristotelian, it's innate, right? It depends on the sort of version of realism. But nonetheless, they believe that the form or the nature or the essence, right, human is real, and that I have it or participate in it, and you have it or participate in it, and so on. And then with that, they believe that the tradition holds that there are four causes of any given thing. So these are Aristotle's four causes. The formal cause, what it is, so that's human. The material cause of what it's made, flesh, blood, bone, that sort of stuff. The efficient cause, how it comes about, procreation from my parents. And then the final cause, right, the telos of the thing, which is the end or purpose for which it exists. Okay, so in that sense, the claim is actually that as a being moves into being, moves into proper formation, there is this process of either like being well formed, where you're actually moving toward proper formation, or divergence, and that's what we call corruption. So if, in the developmental stage, my arm failed to develop and I came out with one arm, that would be a corruption, right? There'd be some way in which the material cause failed to fully receive the formal cause that was communicated to it, so that I am actually like missing one of my arms that I ought to have. And ought to have, in the true sense, is because the form or the nature that I have is two-armed. And so in this sense, we can identify that as a corruption, right? That there's something that has gone wrong in the material reception of the underlying form. But also with that, then there's this assumption about a final cause where there's a connection between the formal cause of the thing, what it is, and the purpose for which it is. So for an eye that is properly formed, when properly formed and healthy and whole, it sees. And so that's the final cause, right? The form, what it is connected with the final cause, the why it is, right? In order to see. You do the same thing with the ear, right? Why do leaves have, why do plants have leaves? For photosynthesis, right? Like you can do this sort of thing all throughout nature. So when we're talking about something like whether something is well-formed or malformed, we're talking about whether or not like the material reception has actually been proper, right? Is it manifesting the nature or essence that's there properly, or is it in some ways divergent from? That's embedded in all that language of like deformity, for example. And with that, there's an assumption that the properly formed, when a thing is properly formed, that includes moving toward its teleological end, its proper function, right? So the eye for seeing, the ear for hearing, leaves for photosynthesis, that sort of thing. Under the natural law tradition, the presumption is that the formal cause of the thing, like what it is, also tells you the final cause, why it is. And then the final cause also tells you the moral use of the thing. So for example, if we talked about something like, let's talk about that digestive system for a second, right? So like, what is the purpose of my digestive system, and we can go into the details, like my teeth are there to break apart food, and then saliva is there to further break it down. My esophagus has the purpose of bringing it down my throat, right? My digestive system and here has to do with breaking it apart and providing nutrients and all this sort of stuff. And then you can get into things like what is immoral about something like bulimia? Well, the idea there is that what makes it immoral is the fact that it's actually violating the purpose of the digestive system, that somehow I'm engaged in breaking up food and I'm taking it into myself. And then rather than letting my body actually do the thing that it's supposed to do with it, which is to supply nutrients and things like that, I'm actually vomiting it up. And so in this sense, there's a violation happening of the proper order of nature that's there in the digestive system. And incidentally, this also goes to a lot of this sort of intuitions that I think, as our culture becomes more health conscious and we're looking at things like the sorts of things we eat and whether they're good for us or not, there's sort of this burgeoning sense of like, maybe it's wrong in some ways to eat stuff that's toxic and poisonous, and maybe we shouldn't take that into our bodies. And in this sense, you get into this sort of ambiguous use of the word good, where some people are like, well, it's not good for you and you ought not to do that, right? And so you run into this territory of, well, is there like a moral claim being made here? And under natural law, you could absolutely make a case that there's something morally problematic about eating in ways that are either gluttonous or eating in ways that are contrary to the good of your body, because you're moving and you're using this sort of thing, right? This digestive system in a way that's actually working, that's counterproductive to the purpose of the thing. And so anyway, it's that same line of reasoning that then goes into things like sexual ethics, right? So what's the traditional Judeo-Christian understanding of why homosexuality, for example, is contrary to the order of nature? Well, the traditional view is that it's rather obvious that the telos of your sex organs has to do with reproduction, right? That's the purpose for which they are there. And since two men can't, use their sex organs in order to procreate, that indicates that it's contrary to the order of nature and that it's immoral, right? Just like bulimia or gluttony or something like that. And then that's also what gets you into some of the sexual ethics concerning even promiscuous sex, right? The idea that even if it's heterosexual sex, the idea that the sort of natural outgrowth of sexual intimacy really does have, as a natural extension, the production of children, and that these sorts of, now we're getting into rights, right? These sorts of relational properties that have to do with duties then sort of carry with it the importance of these two people being in a committed relationship, building a stable environment, family, and so on, which is what we call marriage, right? So anyway, all of that's to say is that within the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that you hear in somebody like Thomas Aquinas, but he's far from the only one, there is a presumption of a connection between the formal cause of thing, what things are, the final cause of the thing, why the thing is, and then the moral use or operation of the thing. Now, that doesn't, that's not unique to Christianity. Yes, Thomas Aquinas is one of the ones who's most known for it in our culture, and that's popularized by Roman Catholicism. But you find the same view in the Stoics, right? The Stoics are very clearly natural law ethicists. And even people like Aristotle, who might not be overtly considered a natural ethicist, he's oftentimes characterized as a virtue ethicist. The underpinning of natural law and the order of nature being part of, the sort of order of morality is definitely tacitly present, if it's not explicitly present, in somebody like Aristotle. So anyway, all of that's to say is that the realist tradition, the Judeo-Christian realist tradition, has always been an advocate of natural law, and that continues not just it's in the Eastern tradition. It actually is there in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. It's there in the Latin West, and it continues to be there even in the Protestant tradition. This is where I was referencing Grabel's work. But what's interesting is somebody like John Locke. John Locke comes along, and he wants to talk about natural law. But Locke is a hard-bitten empiricist, right? His entire essays on human understanding are, what he starts with is an attack on Platonism and innate ideas and all this sort of stuff. And he's advocating basically empiricist nominalism. And so Locke wants to start there. And that's what's so sort of peculiar and odd about the idea that then in his ethics, what he wants to do is he wants to advocate some sort of natural law. So how on earth would you do that if you don't believe that formal causality is real, if you don't believe that final causality is real, if you don't believe that the relational properties that we might talk about between, say, a person and their labor or something like that is real, but it's a mental fiction? It seems that, Hobbes is the more consistent view. Well, Locke tries to do it largely by advocating some form of consequentialism, right? So, and I do think this is the sort of thing that a lot of people today who are not familiar with the classical sort of metaphysical tradition, when they hear natural law, this is really what they think of. They think of something like, well, if you have promiscuous sex, you might get an STD, right? And so because there's this negative consequence, that just means obviously nature is structured in a way that it sort of slaps you around if you do the wrong thing. That's actually not natural law, right? Not in the traditional sense. That's a form of consequentialism, right? The idea that, the consequences, the fact that this has negative consequences, this is the thing that tells you that it's not the right thing to do. And then you try to tether that to the idea that there's a God who structures the world in that way, if you're John Locke, and you get to some form of the consequences being woven into the fabric of it is what makes it natural law. So that, that form of consequentialism, it's been sort of branded natural law, but it's really sort of a different animal than what you're talking about when you're talking about Stoic natural law or Thomistic natural law, these sort of classical natural law traditions, which are deeply grounded in realism. And I think, incidentally, this is one of the reasons why people like David Hume, who was also an empiricist, was so successful in critiquing somebody like John Locke, because when you're talking about sort of the skeptical approach of natural law and these sorts of relational things, if you're really an empiricist, right, you have trouble actually demonstrating that there are any sort of real relational properties, right? Because as an empiricist, the tether between me and my kids is not in some ways an ongoing tether. We can talk about back in the past, that there was some sort of connection between me and their origin point, or their mother and their gestation, or something like that. But that tether is not a current empirical reality. And so this is where somebody like David Hume is able to say, well, that's just sort of a mental invention. You continue to make that association, and then from that you start to make certain, sort of relational claims and things like that. But those aren't empirical realities. And so I think once you go down that road of a sort of nominalist empiricist track, like Locke does, the idea that somehow you can actually retain this sort of natural view of rights, and that you contain these sorts of insist on the sort of real relational properties that are there that undergird what he wants to say about property or about parental rights or whatever else, I think it becomes much harder. And that's where I think Hobbes's view is the much more consistent position if you're talking about those two, right? The position that says, look, these are mental inventions, right? And we can talk about what we think would be proper as a society or what we want to be the case, or something like that. And then what we can do is we can sort of construct social contracts that reflect those values that we have, the things that we want to be. So, but I mean, these are inventions, right? So going with a positivist view of rights there. Now, I, as a realist, however, actually am an advocate of natural law ethics on the one hand, and a natural view of rights. I really do believe that when you're talking about the relational property between me and, say, my son, David, there is no sort of breaking that tie. That's not just a mental fiction. There really is an ontological relation between me and him. Father and son are sort of like real categories having to do with real relational properties. That endure despite any sort of physical distance between us. I don't think that's a mental fiction. And I think with that also the duties that I sense as his father, right, to provide for him, to raise him, those sorts of things, are actual real, moral duties that I have. And then with that, I actually do think that that's where it makes a good bit of sense that then talk about certain rights that I have over him, that in terms of my relationship to him, my duties, my obligations, and things like that, the idea that I have a sort of some sort of natural relationship with him as his father that's different than the man on the street, such that it is like my duty to, say, discipline or correct him or something like that, but not the duty of every person who walks past him on the street to do that sort of thing. And then you get into this territory of parental rights, and the idea that parents have a unique relationship with their children and things like that, and that should be taken very seriously and treated as a sacred thing by the government, for example, and not overridden. I think all of that's very meaningful and very real. Now, the relevance of this is going to be because we're going to have to differentiate what, say, a studio that decides that they want to buy IP, right? We're going to have to differentiate what they have the sort of like legal permission to do and what they have like the moral obligation to do, right? So this is where we're going to have to sort of distinguish whether or not a person has a legal right to do something to intellectual property from the question of whether they actually have the moral right, to do that sort of thing to the intellectual property. And because there's no doubt that Hollywood is not doing something illegal in purchasing, a license in order to do something with Tolkien and then kind of doing whatever they want with it, as long as they don't violate the contract. Obviously, they have a legal right. But the question is whether or not there's something immoral happening. That's what I started with when I was talking about the ways in which people tend to react in this very visceral way that says something like, I think this is wrong, right? And the question is it, right? So by differentiating legal rights from like these sort of natural rights and then also natural duties and morality and so on, you end up moving into territory where we can begin to explore this sort of question, because the question is not whether Hollywood can do that. Obviously they can and they do. The question is whether they ought to, or whether they ought to do better. Are they doing something immoral? And that's what we really want to explore here. Now, before we get to, say the filmmakers' duties or obligations or something like that, let's just talk about these sort of the natural relational properties, the rights and duties and things like that of the original creator, right? The source of the IP, right? What are Tolkien's duties and obligations to his own, world and his own intellectual property? Does J.K. Rowling have certain duties to her own intellectual property and so on, right? Like, let's start there. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is draw a basic distinction between invention and discovery. So one of the things that is sometimes a common confusion is that people will be a little bit sloppy in their language when they'll talk about things like somebody inventing something that they didn't actually invent. For example, like, let's take calculus, right? People talk about like Newton or Leibniz, depending on who you're crediting. You should be crediting Leibniz. They'll be like, yeah, Newton or Leibniz, like invented calculus, and they'll use that language. And the fact of the matter is, like, no, they didn't. They did not. When you're talking about something like mathematical realities, geometric realities, things like that, when you're talking about certain, features of reality that you might be talking about in terms of physics or whatever else, you're not talking about inventions, but discoveries, right? These are, and now, of course, I'm speaking as realist, right? That these are part of the structure of reality that's out there, that mathematics is its own reality, that the laws of physics are their own reality. That's part of the sort of fabric of the world, so to speak, that in some sense, these things are real. And so when a rational mind comes along and discovers, right, unearths certain sort of structures that are there, right, formula, certain sort of, certain patterns, whatever it may be, and they start to, put these in some sort of conceptual framework by which we can start to look at the actual schematic structure of this feature of reality. When somebody does that, they are not inventing calculus. They're discovering it, right? When you just like, and I think people are better. They seem to more intuitively understand this with regard to science generally. Like, people will talk about scientific discoveries. We now know, right? And they talk in this sort of subject-object way about something that's out there that we learn. And I think that's because science has this sort of air about it of some sort of objective knowledge or something like that. It's one of like the few safe havens of a claim to objective understanding about reality that's left in our culture, largely because of the influence of the empiricism of modernity. So on the one hand, our culture is very skeptical. It's inherited the skepticism of empiricism and yet still retains its supreme confidence in the empirical sciences. Anyway, be that as it may, folks are a little better about recognizing that science does this, right? It's discovered this sort of thing. Mathematics is one of these areas where it gets into like a little bit of weird stuff, because if you ask people like, well, is math real? They're kind of like, oh, what is it, right? Because if they're thinking like empiricists, the number 2 isn't something I can just grab hold of. So anyway, not a social construct, actually reflective of structures of reality, mathematics. So these things are discovered, right? Now, this is where there's a difference, though, between, say, that and Harry Potter. And this kind of goes to an interesting feature of how language was seen in certain ancient contexts. So oftentimes, within the realist tradition in, sort of ancient pagan philosophy, there was this view of language that suggested that language was basically like signposts. And this is an important sort of aside that sometimes people will get rather confused about this, especially in our own culture, which really likes to engage in semantic argumentation and treat definitions as if they're just social constructions. But, in the ancient world, there was a recognition that like the sound, right, the name, the utterance that you're giving, you had folks who basically viewed it as like it's a signpost, right? So if I'm going to use the word like cup, right, that sound refers to this, this thing here that is in my hand. And then if I utter the noise microphone, right, I'm referring to this thing here that I'm talking into. And they recognize that like those are just sort of signposts, so that if we just sort of like, but what we're talking about, what the signpost is pointing to is the thing itself, right? It's pointing to something that's real. So if, for example, we started using the word horse, right, and the word horse referred to this, like quadruped, equine beast, we'd say like, okay, that's what the word horse refers to. And then all of a sudden, let's say we just started using the sound horse, right? And we started to use it in reference to a 4-legged, wooden structure that you have dinner at, right? A table, right? What we typically refer to as a table. We wouldn't have in some ways changed the nature of horse. Reality would be unaffected by that shift, just because we started pointing the signpost from here over to there. We've just started to redirect the signpost. We haven't changed or altered the nature of hoarseness, so to speak. And this distinction between sort of the noise, the utterance, the signpost, and the reality is really important. again, I don't want to sort of lose sight of the actual thing that we're talking about here, which is intellectual property and things like that. But a good example of this is the question of the ontological argument. So when I would teach on the proofs for the existence of God, one of the proofs that I'd walk through is the ontological argument for the existence of God. And in that argument, if you're unfamiliar with the argument, it basically just suggests that if God is the greatest possible being, then from that fact, we know that he exists. And I'm not going to go through the argument. I've done that in other episodes briefly, but anyway, suffice to say that when I've taught on this and I walk through the argument, why God being the greatest possible being demonstrates that he necessarily exists, one of the first objections that always comes up in that context is that some student will say, well, what if I don't define God that way, right? Like that's the first sort of pivot. I say that he's not the greatest possible being. And they think, see, I've diverged. I've escaped the argument. Well, have you? Because my immediate response is always, okay, that's fine. You can have the word God, right? And you can use the word God to refer to a quadruped equine beast. Okay. You can do that. All right. But I'll relinquish the word God. And instead I'm going to come up with the word Shmad. And my question is whether Shmad exists. And Shmad points to, the greatest possible being. In other words, what they're confusing is confusing the signpost with the thing itself. The question is whether or not the greatest possible being necessarily exists. And you can call that God, or you can redirect the word towards something else. But that doesn't eliminate the question of, does the greatest possible being actually exist? Now, the reason I bring this up is because when you look at certain, approaches to, ancient education, I think it's Martin Hengel who talks about this in his work on Judaism and Hellenism. Obviously, he's not the only one, but I think it's in there that he talks about the fact that, one of their early questions in ancient education, exploring, the ideas of other cultures, was the question of, is it true or is it false, right? And basically, once you've answered that question, is it true or is it false? Then the next question is, did anybody know it? Now, this is an interesting difference between the way the ancient sort of realists tended to think about ideas and reality and things like that, and the way we do. Culturally, we have a tendency today in our modern culture, because of our skepticism and our empiricism and all this, our sort of loss of connection with realism, we have a tendency to indigenize ideas. Right. And you'll see this all the time where people are like, well, that's a very Jewish idea, or that's a very Greek idea, or that's a very this idea. And we tend to give ownership of a concept to a certain people group. And yet, what's funny is we don't do that with mathematics, right? We don't sit there and go arithmetic, that's a very Chinese idea. Right. No, okay. Yes. People in China did learn arithmetic, but, people and because they discovered it, right. It's there as part of reality. And then there were people in other cultures, right. Greeks also discovered arithmetic because it's just there in reality. And so it sort of betrays our nominalism, the fact that when it comes to ideas and concepts and worldview, that we have a tendency to just give ownership of the concept to the person as if it's an invention, as if it's a mental fiction, not the way the ancients thought. So when asking, and this is one of the reasons that you see in Judaism, one of the reasons that they have a positive view of Plato, is because they don't look at Plato's ideas as Platonic. The very fact that people are oh, well, that's Platonism, or it's they appropriated Platonism or something like that, actually betrays already a very anachronistic view of ideas relative to the ancient world. So somebody like Philo of Alexandria, he'll look at Plato and he'll say, well, what is what is Plato but, Moses speaking Greek? Like that's actually something that Philo of Alexandria said. Now, the reason he says that is because when asking something about like Plato's forms, when he suggests that there, is a God and that there are forms, these archetypal ideas that constitute the structures of reality, the first question that somebody like Philo wants to know is that true? And then if he finds out that it's true, just like with something like calculus, the question is, well, then Plato discovered this, right? Reason guided him to this truth about the structure of reality. Did anybody else discover it? And lo and behold, when Philo looks at Moses, he sees the same thing, right? He sees that, well, God is apparently like referring to things before they exist. Let us make this. And he says, well, that indicates that God has an idea of the thing already, an archetypal idea before he makes it, which indicates that Plato is correct. And so Moses and Plato have, much like Newton and Leibniz, they've discovered something common and true about the world, right? There is a feature of reality, the forms, the archetypal ideas that are the sort of blueprints, as it were, the structure for reality. And Plato discovered that in his way, and Moses discovered that in his way. It doesn't belong to anybody, just like calculus doesn't belong to Newton and it doesn't belong to Leibniz. It's something that's discovered. So the forms, right, realism, the forms is something that was discovered by Plato and also discovered by Moses. And that's kind of how the ancients thought about it. Now, the reason this is important in our current context is because you can own false ideas. Okay, so I can't own calculus. Leibniz can't own calculus, right? Because it's just part of reality. He just found it, right, so to speak. He discerned it. But J.K. Rowling can own Harry Potter. And why? Because it's a fiction, right? It's invented. And this is the important part where you're differentiating the sort of fabrications, our creations, the things that we produce and generate from our own creative powers, from the things that are out there, as it were, that don't originate from us, that we don't own, that we discover. And those are two different things. And that difference goes to something that is very important concerning property rights or duties or things like that. So, for example, as an artist, right? And I've talked about this in other contexts where I've talked about what it means as a realist to talk about myself as an artist. And I've pointed out that art, the word, means skill. And so an artist is one who has cultivated a certain skill set. So if we, you look behind me here, you can see some of my paintings, some of them. Anyway, you could go to my website and see some of my artwork as well. I did the work in order to cultivate a certain skill set in terms of drawing and painting. And so when saying that I am an artist, we're not talking about some sort of social status. In the sort of realist sense, what we're saying is that the skill of drawing and painting is something that was in me in potentia, right? That's something that was a potential within me that I actually cultivated and I nurtured from a potential skill into a concrete realized skill. And that's what makes me an artist. I have that art within me. That skill is within me. And then artwork, right? Or an artifact. Artwork is the outward expression of that. So then when I go ahead and I produce a painting or a drawing or something like that as the expression of that operative power, that operation, that articulation of that inner artwork, or that inner art, right? That inner skill set manifests itself in artwork, right? Now, in this context, this is where there is actually a relational property between me and the artwork, evident in the language that I just used. So just like when we talk about parent and child, and that relationship is not just a social construct, it's different than just saying like, you're my friend. We're talking about something that is actually like has to do with a grounding in the fact that this human being is begotten of me, right? They are sort of produced from my own substance. Well, so in the same way, when you're talking about me as an artist who has a certain skill set and then exercises that art and produces artwork, now there is a relational property between me and it that is meaningful and real and grounded in reality. And so this isn't just sort of like a mental invention. It's not just a mental fiction. There actually is some sort of relational connection, a relational tether between me and the thing. And so the entire idea is that unlike, say, calculus, where it's something you discover, it's just out there, it's not produced by me. And then it's like, hey, did you notice this, right? Did you notice this pattern? Or physics, same sort of thing. Where you discover something. When you're talking about creations or inventions, something like this, you're moving into territory of something that is a direct sort of production of my own powers, right? Some sort of production of my own substance. In this case, we're talking about if we're talking about art, for example, that this artwork is not just artwork, it is my artwork, right? What makes it artwork is the fact that it is the concrete instantiation or expression of my art, that is the skill that is within me. And so that's why all these terms are meaningful. Artist, artwork, my artwork, right? That's why those terms function that way. Now, and again, I go through all of this in much, in plenty of detail in the episode on language and cultural appropriation. But I'm not going to rely on that. We'll rehash some of that here. But that's what provides also the grounding. That relational property is what provides grounding for the sort of meaningful expression that we all sort of intuitively recognize about ownership and about rights. So, for example, I've already said, like, to say that that's my artwork or my painting is meaningful because of the relational property. Also, if you were to come into my house and you were to take it from me and just like run out, you run into my house, grab the painting behind me, and you run out, and I'm like, hey, that's mine, right? You can't take that, right? That's mine. That sort of language, that expression that we sort of just recognize intuitively is indicative not just of sort of like a historical fact or a relational property of that being the production of my own art, of my own skill, but also some sort of natural ownership or right over it as the one who has produced it. And this becomes the grounding for things like property rights. The very fact that that is the outward concrete expression of my own powers, it's in some ways an extension of me that gives me this sort of type of ownership over it. And that becomes the basis for things like markets, right? The idea that somehow I can sit here and say, well, you can't just take it from me. I mean, like, you might, in a Hobbesian sense, you might be strong enough to take it from me. You pull out a gun, and you're like, I'm taking it, right? And I'm like, okay, I guess I'll relinquish it because I don't want to get shot, in order to protect my my painting. Like, maybe you can take it, but when we're talking about the morality, whether like you ought to, whether you have a right to, or things like that, the underlying morality of it, that's actually grounded in the assumption that I do have some sort of innate ownership of it as this sort of outward concrete expression of my own substance. And so for that reason, that's also where the entire notion of markets, where it's like, if you say, well, I would like to buy it in some ways. Well, that right that I have doesn't sort of hinder me. The fact that there's a connection between me and the art doesn't hinder me from selling it, right? Like, I actually do have a right to go ahead and sell it. Now, this is sort of you might intuitively be like, well, Dr. Jacobs, can you sell your children? And the answer is no, but I mean, I could, right? But no, we're not going to engage in human trafficking. Morally, we can't do that, right? But this goes to a duties side of thing. But we'll come back to that, because the fact of the matter is, like, the duties to my children supersede the sort of the ownership extension of selling them or something like that. It's because I have certain duties to them that I can't just sort of sell my children into slavery. But evidently, like, when it comes to my paintings, I don't have the same sort of duty. I don't have a duty to hold on to it, to feed it and shelter it, to teach it right and wrong, and so on. And we can see that just because of a difference in substance. That's pretty obvious. When you're talking about my children are human beings. And so as moral beings, right, who are supposed to be morally formed, as beings who are rational beings and need to be educated, the sort of duties that I have in order to provide for them shelter has to do with their sort of innate sort of vulnerabilities as being beings who need temperature control and, protection from the elements, the fact that they are in need of food and things like that. That's where those duties are tied into. The need to educate them has to do with the fact that they're rational, the fact that they're spiritual beings and moral beings goes to my duties to raise them in the way they should go. So there's a connection between the fact that my children are actually formative entities that are sort of been brought into the world and are being sort of brought, from potential into actuality, that I have certain duties to them to raise them up in accord with teleology, right? So we're now back to the natural law side of things. And so that teleology is what commends and insists upon the fact that I have certain obligations to them in terms of provision, in terms of their intellectual rearing, in terms of their spiritual rearing, in terms of their physical needs and the rest. My paintings aren't like that. My painting is, first of all, not a rational being. So that outward production of my inward potency doesn't have any sort of need in terms of me feeding it, for example. It doesn't have a capacity to learn. And so to educate it is not one of my duties. It doesn't have spiritual and moral capacity. I trust this is all evident. So I won't belabor the point, but you get the idea here. And so when you're talking about that, obviously there are real relational properties in both cases, to my children, to my artwork, but the nature of the things is what also differentiates my duties to the things. So we can't just sort of carry the duties that I have to my children over to my painting because they're of two very different kinds. These are they have different natures. And that difference in nature is definitely one of the things that is why, selling my children strikes us as morally repugnant, whereas selling my painting doesn't, right? I actually do have the freedom, the authority to go ahead and do that, right? I actually can end up producing, if I were a potter, right, I can end up making pots and selling them. That's why nothing about commerce in that sense strikes us as immoral. It's perfectly suitable that a person has cultivated a skill set to make pots and then wants to offer those pots up to people to buy them. It's also why that person has a right, as the one who has this sort of innate ownership of the thing, without any sort of self-determination, right? The thing doesn't have free will or reason, self-determination. So the determination of the thing is entirely on the one who has produced it, to also give it away, right? Like you could just be like, well, it's mine. And so I'm not going to charge you. You can just have the painting, right? And you'd be, oh, that's very generous. And it may well be very generous. But that's within my prerogative because it does not have self-determination. It's not an autonomous being the way, a child is. And so in this sense, like I can actually determine its fate and hand it over. So this becomes the basis actually for a realist basis for when you're talking about like property rights and free markets, right? The idea that says that you have certain goods that I want and you have the rights over those goods and you and I can engage in some sort of free will transaction by which I can offer to you certain things that are mine and you can offer to me certain things that are yours. And if we both agree, we can make the trade and we're both happy. And there we go. I relinquish my ownership over to you. That's the basis for property and, free exchange, right? Free markets, that sort of thing. Okay. So that entire sort of framework that I just offered is actually the basis of the sorts of things that we're talking about when we're talking about intellectual property. Let's say, I wrote a series called Jack Stevenson's, outer space journey. Wow, that was campy and ridiculous, but that was actually kind of the point. Okay, so I've got Jack Stevenson. He's like the new whatever, Buck Rogers or whatever. And so like Jack Stevenson, this is the hottest thing out there. All the kids love this book and the studios, Hollywood is just clamoring to get their hands on this. And so Warner Brothers comes to me and they say, we've got to have it, right? We've got to have Jack Stevenson. And I'm like, well, hey, I'm willing to, well, am I? And then they drive a truckload of cash up to me. I'm like, you can have Jack. Do whatever you want with it, right? I'll take the money. And so we do our exchange, and I've signed over the rights to let them do what they want with Jack Stevenson. So that is sort of the basis of what we're talking about here. Jack Stevenson is this sort of this production of my own substance, my own imagination, creativity, and so on and so forth. And then that thing that I have produced is something that I willfully hand over in exchange for something that Warner Brothers has that I want. And so we've engaged in that sort of exchange. And so now the question is like, well, at that point, do I have any say over what happens, or should I have any say? Does Warner Brothers have any obligations to old Jack Stevenson, or to me, or to the world that I've invented, or things like that? And that's really sort of where we're getting into the sort of fine points of this question. Now, on the one hand, you could just say like, no, right? Like, you don't. It's mine. I bought it. I can do whatever I want to it, and that certainly is a certain form of like free market capitalist sort of impulse. And I don't say that as somebody who's opposed to free markets. I'm actually in favor of free markets, but on the basis of the very things that we're talking about here. But I do think that there is that the impulse that says it's mine, I can do with it whatever I want, actually does carry a significant blind spot, because I don't think that's quite true. And I think that's because when we're talking about these sorts of issues, it's not just a question of ownership. Right? Think about it with regard to my children. I know we don't want to like talk about ownership with regard to our children, so we can just talk about these sort of like relational properties. But obviously there is some sort of tether between me as their father and them that is different than somebody else who just sort of gets into a free will relationship with them, like a friendship. And because of that, but that relationship actually carries a significant number of duties, and we recognize that in this context. And we also don't like ownership because in that context, because we recognize that they're self-determining beings and so on. But I think the very fact that relational properties of this kind end up carrying certain duties and obligations doesn't cease just because you're not dealing with a sentient being. When I look at, for example, a work of art, well, let's not use mine. So who knows? Maybe you don't like my artwork. That's fine. But let's use like Michelangelo's Pietà, right? Something that is unquestionably glorious. One of the crowning achievements of artistic expression. And it doesn't matter whether you like it. Again, this is a longer aside, and I've talked about like art and AI. You could go listen to that episode where I talk about this. So I'm not going to get sidetracked on that. But there's a difference between whether you like it or not and whether it's objectively good or not, right? The fact of the matter is that Michelangelo had cultivated as a skill set, the highest degree of human potency, right? The highest degree of human capacity to sculpt, had nurtured that potential into like its utmost actuality, in terms of the skill set of sculpting. And so when you look at the Pietà, for example, as an example of the expression of that artwork is the height of human artwork, of human art. Whether you like it or not, taste, enjoying it or not, that's different, right? And this is actually a really important point. A lot of times people will confuse whether they like something with whether it's good. Whether it's good has to do with the objective qualities. Whether you like it has to do with you, and you may be right to like it or you may not. Anyway, that's a longer discussion. Many of us like things we ought not, and we don't like things that we ought. And whether you like it or not is different than whether it's good. Okay. That's why it's meaningful to talk about good taste and bad taste, because it's a question of whether your taste aligns with reality. Anyway, we're not going to go down that road, but we're just taking as our example, just something like that, which is sort of an expression, something not sort of, it actually is. We're taking somebody, Michelangelo, who is an artist, meaning he had the art right within him. He had cultivated that art within him to the highest degree possible, an optimal degree possible for a human being. And the artwork, right, the outward expression in something like the Pietà is actually, this manifestation, an artwork that is like the pinnacle of human artistry. Is there something tragic, something wrong with just coming in and taking a sledgehammer to it? I would say absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. There is something wrong with doing that. Now, why though? Right? Like, why is it that sort of strikes me as not just like, oh, right? Like, there's this visceral reaction. Why does it have sort of moral connotations to it? And I think the answer is that because I'm a realist, I recognize that goodness has an ontological component to it, right? So unlike a consequentialist where you just sit there, or a utilitarian where you're just sort of measuring pleasure and pain, right? For a utilitarian, they're like, well, I think good and evil just refer to like whether something brings about pleasure and pain. If you're consequentialist, you're sitting here trying to like fast forward and say, well, what are the consequences? What's the bad stuff that might happen? Which ends up actually falling into a form of utilitarianism, because bad stuff usually, as an empiricist, ends up being defined as unpleasant. Whereas like the classical sort of realist tradition recognized that being itself is good. And so you've probably heard, well, for folks who have listened to me before, you've probably heard me talk about the great chain of being. And the great chain of being is this presumption within classical pagan thought and then Christian thought, Judeo-Christian thought, is this idea that our world expresses this sort of like diverse hierarchy of being, of intelligibility. And being doesn't just mean stuff, right? It means intelligible traits, the sorts of things that the mind identifies in those sort of structural observations. And so, you have rocks, right? And rocks have certain sort of baseline properties, intelligible structures to them, being, right? And yet, then when we get to plants, we see new perfections, if you're going to use the medieval term, right? Things like life and growth, right? So they have the sorts of structures they overlap with the sorts of structures that you see in rocks, but there's these additional perfections that are there. And then above those, you start to get these other sort of things like animals, where they have not only the same sort of like life and growth and things like that, but and as well as all these sort of intelligible structures, intricate intelligible structures to their physical nature, right? But also that they have sentience and they have self-propulsion and things like that. And then with human beings, you add to this like reason and free will. And then you get into the hierarchy of angels where, they have these sorts of other powers than we have, plus, the sort of relative immortality and things like that. And the idea was always that, God, who is sort of like infinite being, begins to articulate himself in a series of finite articulations of being. That's where you get these intelligible structures. And the idea is that because God is infinite, right, in order to fill up the concept of like this infinite being that is God, you have to do it when you're doing it in finite terms. You have to sort of fill it up in a diversity of ways. You might think of it like this way. Like Bach. Let's take Bach, who is always my chosen musician. If we wanted to understand that sort of like unarticulated wellspring of creativity that's underneath him, we would end up saying like, well, how do we get it, right? Because if I just told you like he's brilliant, the question would be like, okay, what does that mean? And the best way to show you is for him like to compose something or play something. But the thing is, what we recognize is that like not every composition can do the same thing. Like there is no one single perfect piece of music, because every piece of music captures something different. This is actually something this is something that I started to realize as an artist. I struggled as an artist. I wanted to be like, I was like, what's the best form of painting? And the problem is you ran into the fact that there was certain forms of painting that part of the appeal of it was like, well, that it was highly realist and it was so smooth. You can see any brush strokes and there was a subtlety to it. And then you would see other things that are extremely painterly and you could see the brush strokes to them. And the sort of movement of the paint was really important to it. And then, anyway, the point is that I started to realize as a painter that there was no single style that captured the goods of all the others, that you had certain goods that couldn't overlap. And you see the same thing in music. Bach could do something that's very subdued and very contemplative. He could do something that's highly minimalistic. He could do something that's highly complex and intricate. Anyway, I'm moving out of my area of expertise when I'm talking about music in that way. But we'll use the example, the very example. Why am I using music? I'll use one of my area of expertise. When you're talking about, say, the subtlety of something where you're talking about like glaze painting, where the very fact that the brush strokes are completely invisible and there's a certain subtlety to the transition, gradation, and things like that, that is a very genuine good, right? That is expressing a certain skill set, but it's incompatible with painterliness, where everything is about quick and moving and things like that. Also a good, but a good of a different kind, and they're incompatible. And so this is one of the things that if we were talking about an artist, right, and you wanted to show the diversity of what an artist can do, you couldn't do it in just a single painting, right? There would need to be a full portfolio, right? All the different things that are there within the wellspring would have to come out, because all the different sort of goods that are possible, artistically speaking, can't be manifest simultaneously. Some of them are incompatible with one another. And so that's why, they each provide an expression. If you were going to study Bach, you would have to study the whole of his musical corpus to really sort of understand who he is and underneath. And each of those would have its own sort of manifestation of the underlying creativity. Well, so in the same way, the great chain of being was seen as exactly that God is articulating his wisdom and his power and his goodness and things like that in these finite expressions of being. So you get diversity of species when you're talking about these sort of overlapping properties, but then there's difference, right? Differentiating properties. So a bird is bipedal and a human is bipedal, but a bird is winged and a human is not. So all of these different expressions become the way in which the infinite being, the infinite boundless being of God, ends up being articulated in these sort of finite expressions. And that's where they overlap, and there's diversity and things like that. But then on top of that, it's not just the sort of diversity of the various properties, say like winged versus bipedal versus quadrupedal, but also the fact that then they are part of our harmonious whole that we call the cosmos, right? That harmony and the relational properties between them and all of that is also an important part of that. Now, the reason I say all that is because within the realist tradition, the commitment is that being itself is good, that intelligibility is itself a good thing, right? That there's that being and goodness are in some ways tied together. So goodness, when you're talking about goodness, you're not just talking about pleasure. You're not just talking about pleasant or desirable consequences. You're talking about these sort of intelligible structures of reality itself. And the reason that's important is because what that means is that things become ends in themselves, right? The very fact that there is, an eye that has the sorts of intelligible structures to it, the eye is good, right? Being itself is good. And incidentally, I think this is one of the only ways to make sense of certain impulses that we might have, like the concern for endangered species, right? I'm not convinced that an atheist, materialist, nominalist, whatever, can meaningfully say that it's a bad thing for a species to die out. But a realist could, right? A realist could sit here and say, well, there is something innately good, right? An inherent value and goodness to a certain type of animal. The very fact that it exists and it has these intelligible structures and properties and things like that is a good, right? It's an additive good to the world. And so in this way, it has value in and of itself, and the sort of wiping out of it would actually be a bad thing. And so it would make sense for somebody who's a realist, who's an advocate of the great chain of being, to be like, no, I think we should work to try to not destroy our cosmos, work contrary to the order of nature or its teleological ends. We should work to operate in accord with it and harmoniously with it. And we should also then, with this, try to be good stewards of, preserving and protecting the structure that's here, right? That's been given to us by God, that's been ordered by God, that's an expression of his wisdom and his goodness. I mean, if you're an atheist and it's all just happenstance and survival of the fittest, then survival of the fittest. Or at best, you could go to a consequentialist argument that somehow it might negatively impact our ecosystem or something like that. But that's the only place you can go. The instinct that seems to say it is good and it is glorious and it is something to be preserved and treated well and properly stewarded, that's a realist impulse having to do with just sort of the innate goodness of being itself, which I actually do advocate. Now, the reason I bring that up is because that innate goodness then goes to something like Michelangelo's Pieta. When somebody like Michelangelo, who is an artist, who has like cultivated the act of drawing that potential art, into reality, and he now has this artwork that is in some ways additive to the being of the world, right? He has sort of brought this potential perfection into a concrete reality within his person. And that when he ends up creating, right, producing this artwork, that artwork as an expression of that inner art actually is a contribution to the intelligible structures, to the being of reality. And it has an innate value to it. And so there is sort of, just like you would say, like you might look at, that you shouldn't just sort of destroy animals for fun, because there's an innate goodness to them and intelligibility and being to them. So in the same ways, right, the production of the Pieta is also part of the being, the intelligible structures, the being and the goodness that's there out there in the world. And that's why it shouldn't be treated flippantly, where you're like, well, just for fun, I'm going to take a sledgehammer to it. And I think in this sense, this is what gives you the explanation for why we shouldn't engage in sort of like a gross capitalism, where the idea is, well, let's say I bought the Pieta. I have no idea what that would cost, but let's say I bought it, right? Like I end up becoming the new Elon Musk. I'm a multi-billionaire. And so I can buy the Pieta, and I buy the Pieta, and I buy it just in order to take a sledgehammer and destroy it. I would actually identify that as immoral. And it would be immoral, not because the idea that I can buy it is immoral. That's perfectly fine. But the idea that I would buy it and then do violence to this articulation of goodness and beauty and truth, this intelligible additive structure to the world, just for kicks. Right. There actually is no moral justification for it. There is no, like, it's not as if, destroy the Pieta or, all of Australia gets nuked or something like that. There's no moral justification. It's just me doing it for kicks actually would be an immoral act. And so I do think when we're talking about whether or not people have certain duties to certain types of creations, I think the answer is yes. Like, on the one hand, I do own these paintings, but, having articulated those, there is a certain duty that I do have in terms of how I handle them. And even though if I sold them to somebody, I could sell them to somebody, and that somebody could legally go ahead and just destroy them for kicks, I think that would be an immoral act. And it would be an immoral act because they are actually additive in terms of the being and the structure of the world. They have an innate value and goodness to them as artwork, as the true outward expression of inward art. So applied to a studio, if we're talking about like, what did I say? Like Jack Stevenson? I think that's what I said. I don't know. I just made that up. So Jack Stevenson, like my Rocketeer space guy. So if, Jack Stevenson was true artwork, right? It wasn't schlock, right? It was actually an expression of my creative genius and my skill in storytelling and things like that. That IP would have that same sort of thing. It would actually be a work of art, right? It would be an artifact out there that is this concrete instantiation of my artwork and this sort of intellectual world, right? This creation of mine. And if Warner Brothers wanted to buy it, and they did buy it, even though they would have a legal right to do with it what they want, I think just like it would be immoral for me to buy the Pieta and then just take a sledgehammer to it just for kicks because I feel so powerful, right, that I can just do that. That would be it would be immoral for Warner Brothers to buy Jack Stevenson and then proceed to, like, in some ways, like, gut it and do, negative things to it, to in some ways decimate it and destroy it. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is the question of whether there are obligations to the audience, because I do think oftentimes audience members feel betrayed, right? Like they have some sort of right or ownership or something like that. I think that's the sort of thing that I was talking about earlier on, where I was saying, like, audience members, super fans, people seem to be outraged, right, that somebody has treated the IP in this sort of way. And I had raised the question of whether or not that outrage, which has a moral undercurrent, is justified or not. I think it is. But I think that outrage is not because the fans have some sort of right to it, right? Just because you can come into my house and enjoy my paintings doesn't mean you have like a right to come into my house and enjoy my paintings or something like that. So I don't think what's happening there is that the fans' rights have been violated in some ways. I think what's happening instead is that the fans are fans because they recognize that innate good. So just like when I talk about the Pietà is this outward expression of Michelangelo's art, I as an artist can look at that and I can appreciate it. I can see, the manifest skill that's there. I recognize it as an observer. And I think what happens is not that if somebody like went ahead and just destroyed it for kicks, it wouldn't be that somehow I've been betrayed because it's not my artwork, right? But what would happen is I would just recognize the injustice of it, right? You don't have to be the parent of a child to know that if a child is like sold into, like human trafficking, that there's something wildly immoral and unjust about it and be outraged about it, right? Like that outrage is justified as a moral being who has looked out into the world and observed a grave injustice. And I think that's what's happening. I don't think it's that the fans themselves have any sort of claim to ownership. I don't think it's that the fans themselves have been violated. I think what's actually happening is that the fans themselves are fans because they recognize the good of the thing. And then when they see that that good of a thing has been in some ways violated, they feel a suitable and appropriate outrage because they're witnessing an injustice, an immorality that is directed against some good that they actually recognize should be treated differently. They recognize the injustice and the immorality of the act. And so as fans, that's why that particularly irks them and they rise up. So I would say that it wouldn't be quite true to say we've been betrayed, that sort of thing, as if some of their rights have been violated. But the outrage is completely justified and suitable in the sense that they are fans because they recognize the good. And so for that reason, they're acutely, like they're tuned in to the injustice and the maltreatment, the immorality of the act when the material that they're fans of ends up being violated in the ways that you might see. And now, again, like this goes into the ought versus can thing. Like, so can a studio do that, right? Like legally, yes, of course they can, right? Legally, somebody can, buy the intellectual property and do with it whatever they want. But ought they to do that? And the answer is no. And I think the answer is no, because it's going into that sort of territory that I talked about a genuine immorality. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the sort of specifics of how we might see this Hollywood taxidermy take place, right? Because all of this is about the fact, the very thing that I talked about the fact that Hollywood has this tendency to say, well, we need something that's going to sell, right? So that we have a way of mitigating our big financial risk here. So let's find something that has a built-in audience, something that sells. Let's buy that. And in a sense, we sort of have bought an audience and mitigated our risk. And now that we have that, right, and this is where the taxidermy part comes in, now we're going to like kill it, gut it, and stuff it with what we want. Now, I want to create a contrast here. I don't think every movie adaptation is that. I talked about Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, and I think I talked about this in the previous in that episode where I talked about Hollywood Taxidermy and the Mary movie and things like that. Peter Jackson, I think, recognized that he was a steward of something, that this wasn't his invention, right? That this is Tolkien stuff and that he bought it. He recognized the genius and the brilliance of that. He recognized that that carried with it certain duties to tend it well. And I think Peter Jackson, even if you don't like the movies, or if you disagree with certain things that decisions that Jackson made, which I do disagree with certain decisions that Jackson made, I don't think anybody doubts that Peter Jackson had the intention of being true to the story. So Jackson recognized that there are people, artists, who have devoted their entire lives to illustrating Tolkien's world. And in this sense, they are devotees. Sorry, that came out weird. To to Tolkien's thought, to Tolkien's world, to Tolkien's lore. And he brought them in intentionally because he recognized, okay, like you have stewarded this material in a way that is deeply loved and is sort of like true to the material, and folks who love the material have begun to, for that reason, sort of incorporated your sort of vision of Tolkien's world, your way of envisioning Tolkien's world, into their own sort of consciousness in terms of how they read this. And so I'm going to bring you in to help me steward the visual creation of this world, right? He did that sort of thing. He brought in scholars, recognizing that Tolkien is very deep, right? Tolkien is a linguist. Tolkien is very schooled in philosophy and theology. There are layers and layers to his thought, and he built this world in a more intricate and layered way than most worlds are ever built, from the languages to the cultures to the background, of every, of each people group within it, and the multiple ages of Middle Earth and all that, the rest of that. And rather than just sort of being presumptuous that Jackson's like, yeah, I read the books, I read them once, I can make this into a movie. He actually recognized that there is so much here, so much that is nuanced and layered, from the languages to the geography to everything else. I really need experts. I need people who know Tolkien's mind and his work and all this. And so he brought in and surrounded himself with people who knew the material, and he tried to handle it in a way that stewarded it well. Okay. So you can sit there and say, like, well, there are certain creative choices that he made that I disagree with, or there's certain ways in which he reads, aspects of Tolkien's story that I disagree with. You could say that. That's fine. But I don't think Jackson could be faulted morally on that ground, because what's happening is that Jackson was very clearly seeking to be a good steward of the material. He was doing his due diligence, morally speaking, in order to tend and take care of that. That is a world of a difference between somebody who comes in and says, well, we bought this, we own it, I'm the director. I'm going to do with this whatever I want. I don't like what Tolkien did here. I'm not going to do that. And I really don't like his portrayal, or his views of women just seem to not sit well with me. So I'm going to take his women and I'm going to rewrite them in a way that fits my view of women. And then, I don't care about, his worldview. If he's a natural law ethicist, well, I'm not. And so I'm going to insert my own worldview. That's where you're talking about Hollywood taxidermy. Or what's happening is, rather than stewarding the thing that's there, you're actually gutting it, right? You are gutting it and now using it basically as a Trojan horse, where it's like, I want to say what I want to say, and I want to build the characters that I want to build, and I want to tell the story that I want to tell, and I'm just going to use the skin of Tolkien. And there's something genuinely dishonest about that. And I say it's dishonest, Trojan horse. I say it's dishonest because really what you're doing is you're going out and telling people, like, hey, you like Tolkien, come buy a ticket, give me your money. And yet you're doing a sleight of hand, right? They're being sold a false bill of goods. They're not really being sold Tolkien. They're being sold, you wearing around Tolkien's skin, like you're, freaking Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs or something like that. And notably, as anybody who likes Tolkien would be horrified by that sort of thing. Now, inevitably, there's always going to be at least two factors that I think are inevitable when it comes to sort of translating intellectual property into film. And one of those is going to be that you always have to, because it's a different medium, there's always going to be a need in adaptation to change certain things, right? Like, just as an example, to use the one that I use with Lewis, a lot of the magic of Lewis's story, and this is part of what I think is really difficult about translating Lewis to film, is his narration, right? The fact that he slips into these like monologues talking about the psychology of the person, and that's where he's really sort of doing subtle, tacit philosophy and theology and things like that. And that's what people are engaged with. And the outward action of it, if you were just portraying what's happening, is relatively simple and kind of boring and not really as engaging as his sort of narrative monologue. And so now the thing is, like in a book, you can do that. In a movie, you can't really do that. And so you're forced into, well, what are your options in terms of like what to do with that material? Do you resort to having a narrator that's always going forward? Or do you have to like take some of that material and put it in the mouth of a certain character? Or do you have to figure out a way to visually tell the same thing without like saying the thing? Like you're going to be forced in adaptation inevitably to diverge. Right. And so that's an inevitability just because of the difference in medium. Right. Now, the second inevitability, I think, is that people sort of envision characters differently, and I don't think that's a complete like that characters are blank slates. Obviously, authors and solid writing and things like that creates a certain persona that's there. But I do think, imaginatively, how a person sort of has a picture of a character in their head is going to be slightly different than how the next guy has a picture in his head. And then when some director comes along and they have to come up with a concrete instantiation, an actor, a costume, all this sort of stuff, inevitably, there's going to be people who are upset and are like, that's not what I pictured, right? And they'll talk in very sort of determinative terms, like that's not what so-and-so is like. And it's like, well, sometimes there's truth to that, right? Like sometimes there's a genuine divergence. And sometimes, there's sort of, they're making their own imaginative construct a little too objective and concrete, a little more so than it is, a little more definitive than it is. So I think those are sort of two inevitabilities when engaging in adaptation that just sort of have to be acknowledged. But what are the things that are not inevitable? What are the things that like really need to be avoided? And I think the first is that, you have to avoid essential divergence from some of the characters or elements of the film. Let me touch here on like the complaints that have happened concerning like race or gender swapping, this being a good example. Is it inevitable that any sort of change in race or gender or hair color or something like that is inevitably a violation of the story? I'm not convinced it is. Now, I know that there's probably people going, what? Jacobs, you think we can just like swap around genders and races and whatever, and it doesn't matter? I didn't say that. But let me use an example that I suspect that I haven't heard any outrage over. Commissioner Gordon. Okay, I'm sure there's somebody who was outraged because in the new Batman, Commissioner Gordon is black. But let's go back before that. Commissioner Gordon in the comic books is a redhead. I don't think any of the film adaptations have ever had a redhead. And this is actually kind of a funny thing. There's this whole like meme of the massive catalog of redheads that just keep on being like swapped out for either brunettes or other races or whatever. And like, what is with like, why does Hollywood hate redheads? Anyway, Commissioner Gordon is on the list, right? So Commissioner Gordon in Batman is a redhead. I don't think he's always a brunette, like prior to like the most recent one. And even there, he's a brunette. He's a black guy. And so like, do I think it's some sort of violation of the comic book that Commissioner Gordon is a brunette rather than a redhead? Like, no, I don't think it is. And so do I think that there's certain characters in which the race is a matter of indifference, like that can be, you can cast somebody else who maybe in the book it's presumed or even said that they're Caucasian and instead, now they're a black character. I think there are instances in which that can be done without a problem. I don't think that's an issue. But there are cases in which it matters. And so this goes to the question of like, when looking at this, right, is it a point of significance that this character is a certain race? But obviously there are places like when it does matter, right? So if, for example, in a story, you have two white parents and they have a white kid, and in the movie you want to cast a black kid. And so now all of a sudden in the movie, you have to either just ignore the fact that his parents are both white, or you have to fabricate a new narrative where he's adopted or something like that. Now you've actually moved into a substantive change. So I think there is that. I think there's also when stories have gone into sort of a substantive reason for identifying the sort of like the hair or the skin color or whatever of a certain character that matters. So for example, Snow White, she's actually called that in the stories because her skin is like super white, right? And so that sort of like stark contrast between her dark hair and her white skin is an important part of the story. It's like in the title, right? So it's really weird to be like, hey, we're going to cast the Latina. No offense to Latinas. They're great, right? But not, what you would cast if you're going for like super white, Snow White, sort of thing like that. This is a case in which it matters. And so this is where, those sorts of substantive things, they really do matter. And you see other sort of examples that you could obviously bring up, like the new Captain America. It's not that I care whether or not the fact that like Hawk or whatever he is, like the guy that they cast there is Captain America. What I'm ticked off about related to that is that in the comic books, Bucky is supposed to become the new Captain America. And so there's sort of like this weird, like, well, we need to make the new Captain America black. We didn't cast Bucky as black, so we're going to make the new Captain America, the gauntlet's going to be passed to this guy. And that's just like, that's contrary to canon, right? Like it's contrary to the source material. So anyway, all of that's to say is that there's certain things like that. There's certain places where it doesn't matter, right? And there's certain places where it does matter. And so it's really important when attending to these sorts of changes, if you're going to make changes, to make sure that what you're changing is accidental rather than essential. And I'm not just talking about gender. I'm not just talking about race. I'm not talking about hair color. I'm also talking about when you're going to change something. Like, let's say you're going to change, say, when Aragorn gets the sword, right? That's in the books. He doesn't get the sword when he gets it in the movie, right? So you have to look at that sort of thing and say, is that a substantive? I'll leave it to you to decide. Is that a substantive change that matters? Or is that an okay one? Is that an accidental trait that it's okay to sort of like move that over here for dramatic purposes? Does it or doesn't it? But the point is that you really do need to, when making these sorts of changes in the adaptation, make a decision about whether or not you're adjusting something accidental or essential. I mean, again, like let's take the C.S. Lewis example when I talked about the fact that you would have to deal with the narration. If you're not going to put in a narration, if you're going to instead take a line from the narrator and put it in the mouth of a character because you think that's more cinematic, does that make sense, right? Does it make sense for that character to say, is that in keeping with the character that Lewis has built and things like that? Like those are the sorts of questions you have to ask. You can't just sort of like willy-nilly just start to change things without attending to the structure. You really need to be attentive to whether or not you are modifying something that is an essential or an accidental trait of the material. And then there's also these more sort of like subtle, structural things or meta things. There's obviously the rules of the universe itself, right? So it's important when attending to a world that each world, if it's properly constructed, if it's properly built, there are rules to the universe. Like anybody who's engaged in any kind of storytelling, world building knows this. And so it's an important question. Is the change that you're making, are the things that you're saying, are they in accord with the rules of this universe? And this also goes into sort of the point about like motives matter. And what I mean by motives matter is, let's just say, for example, like, okay, the new Little Mermaid. I found it hilarious when I saw an image of King Triton with all of his daughters, because they were all different races. And I was like, wait a second. So does Triton have like a harem? Like he's got a harem of wives that are like all different races, and that's why he's got all these kids? Or am I to believe that somehow within this world, it doesn't matter what sort of, two people you put together, you put somebody who's Asian with somebody who's, white, and you might get a black kid, right? Like, is that what I'm supposed to believe? Like, which one is it? And obviously it doesn't address that. Like, it's just sort of this weird casting diversity thing. And so those sorts of things are an example of something where it's like, well, the rules of the universe matter. If you're just going to start to insert diversity for diversity's sake, you've actually moved outside of the story structure and the author and things like that into your own agenda, right? Like now what's happened is you are no longer being a steward of the material. You've got your own thing to do here, right? Like it's an incumbent upon me to go ahead and get this diversity in here, and the rules of the universe and the author be damned. And so that would be an example where it's like, you better explain that, right? You better explain it either that he's got a harem, or that in this world, it doesn't matter. Two different races get together and you might get a third race come out of it, right? Like you're going to need to somehow address that in the rules of the universe and do it in a way that's not violative of the source material if you're really going to steward it. And similarly, you get similar sorts of things with a lot of like feminist characters, right? So it's inevitable, right, that in something like if you're going to adapt Little Women that you have in our contemporary culture, that somebody's going to look and be like, good, Joe, we finally have our opportunity to be full on like third wave feminists, and you're going to project that backwards on it. Or, and this is one of the areas where with like Peter Jackson, you're going to say, well, we've got a woman who wants to go to war, and she ends up like sort of like going to war and end up killing the Witch King and all that. Like if you're going to go down that road, inevitably there's a little bit of feminism that comes through in Peter Jackson. And I don't think it's actually true to Tolkien, right? Like I think with Tolkien, even though, sort of the key beats that are there that show up in Jackson are also in Tolkien. I think Tolkien has a different worldview and a different moral to that story than Jackson intends. Now, the reason I sort of like give Jackson a little bit of a pass on that, and I only say a little, I say little because I'm still obviously calling it out that I disagree with it, but is that I think that's actually Jackson sort of acts. I don't think that's heavy-handed agenda. I think that's Jackson being a product of a feminist culture that's been heavily influenced by feminism, and so that's what he sees there. And he doesn't have the proper, like he didn't have anybody around him to put that in check and be like, oh, that's actually not probably what Tolkien's worldview really is, and that's probably not the moral of that story. So I think it's an honest mistake. I don't think it's an agenda-driven sort of like active injustice or something like that. But obviously there are plenty of folks who do that when they purchase the IP, and they'll say like, okay, where's the woman that we're going to elevate and make the strong female lead, right? How can we invent a female character who's going to be the female counterpart of the man? So even though in the story there's only the man is like the main character, who can we give the strong woman who's really the one who advises him behind the scenes, and she's like the woman behind the man because we need to elevate her above the man? Those sorts of things are very intentional. Like now you're sort of you're injecting into the story and modifying the story with your own agenda. And I say modifying the story because let's just say, for example, that that you had a character, right, who is a male character who's supposed to be a strong male character who's motivated by his own ambitions, and who is, and in this sense, he's sort of like on some sort of, let's say he's a king or something like that, right? He's a king who's driven by his own power and so on and so forth. But you want to have a strong female counterpart. So you end up inserting into the story a queen who is there in the source material, but not significant in the source material. And now she becomes elevated, and she's really sort of the power broker behind the scenes who's like puppeteering things. And like in this sense, she's sort of like moving the chess pieces for the king and so on. Let's say you did something like that. If you did something like that, you actually are writing a different story now, right? You've changed the main character, right? The king character that you have is now a different character, because rather than being sort of driven by his own ambitions, he's now being puppeteered, right? Rather than him being sort of like the main, let's say he's a villain in it. Now, the queen is the real villain. She's like the villain behind the villain and so on. And so this is where like you have to be very careful if you're sort of engaged in some sort of additive process with regard to a story, because you might say, well, we need a female character in here, or we need more diverse characters in here, whatever it is. And in the process, you might be actually writing a different story. That might not just be a accidental change, like whether or not Commissioner Gordon is a redhead or a brunette. That might actually end up being a structural change where you now have engaged in writing a different story or creating a different character that's there in the source material. And then with that, I think you also have these much more subtle layers, which unfortunately a lot of like script writers aren't equipped to engage, which is like the underlying worldview sort of stuff. So I've griped about this a little bit with like, I did a couple of pieces on my Substack about Rings of Power when it first came out. And we can link to those below. But one of those that I talked about is I talked about the underlying worldview, and the problem being that the way in which it portrays Galadriel in season 1 and her sort of in the way in which it handles good and evil, that first of all, the way it handles good and evil is kind of manichaeistic. And this is where I talked about where the way the characters talk about evil, it makes evil substantive. So manichaeistic, this goes to a view of metaphysical dualism, what's called metaphysical dualism in the ancient world, where good and evil are two substances. Sometimes they're two equal and opposing gods, right? So sometimes they're substances like matter is evil and spirit is good. Sometimes they're two principles, right? Two gods that are at work, like love and strife, if you're talking about Empedocles or something like that. But the idea is that both good and evil are equally substantive. But within the Christian tradition, evil is not actually a substance, right? Goodness is a substance, as I already talked about, like that being is good. Evil is always privative or a distortion, right? So the idea being that any sort of divergence from proper formation, any divergence from teleology, that's what we mean by the term evil. So when we're talking about like a physical evil, like blindness, it's not an addition to my eye, it's a subtraction. The proper formation has been violated, and with that, the proper teleological end of seeing. That's what we call a physical evil. Well, Tolkien is a Christian, and this is one of the reasons, and this comes through in things like ring wraiths and that language of like a wraith, which is ties with wreath, which has to do with twisting and things like that. It has to do with this sort of like vacuum, right? This twisting that happens of being. He's reflecting in the way he talks about evil. He's talking about it in the sort of privative terms of the Christian tradition. But Rings of Power doesn't get that. And so they start talking about it like it's substances, like the evil is something that can be touched and all this sort of stuff. And the language there moves into a metaphysical dualism, which violates Tolkien's worldview. And then also with that, some of the things that it has to do with like Galadriel and just sometimes you need to just touch the darkness, like all this sort of stuff. That actually moves, under a sort of natural law view and a realist sort of view of the kind that you might find in somebody like Tolkien. Galadriel actually becomes evil, not virtuous. And so these get into the more sort of subtle areas of worldview when you're talking about the underlying like philosophy, right? When you're talking about the underlying ethics. But those things, again, they matter for good, nuanced storytellers. Somebody like a C.S. Lewis or somebody like a J.R.R. Tolkien. There actually is an underlying worldview. And this is why you can get discussions of like George Lucas, right? Is there a metaphysical dualism in the way he portrays the Force? Is there pantheism? There's a lot of discussions about the underlying philosophy that sit underneath there. And it's important to actually understand the underlying philosophy so that when you get into dialogue, so that you get into the sorts of decisions that are being made, that you know that you're operating in accord and harmoniously with the underlying, not just world and rules of the world, not just characters and the sort of characters that have been built, but also the underlying worldview, the morality, the ethics, right? The things that are there in the sort of structure, the metaphysical structure of the story itself. Now, those things, I think, actually, in identifying that, right, I think I've actually already identified what are the obligations or the duties that a person who decides to purchase the right to IP and steward it, to be a good steward, and to fulfill their duties to that and not violate the goods that are there in this thing. what do they need to do? And I think it's exactly that. It's exactly the sort of stuff that I talked about, that they have to understand the rules and structures of the world. They have to understand the characters. They have to be sure that if they're modifying something in the adaptation, that they're modifying an accidental rather than essential property. They need to understand also not just the rules of the universe and make sure that they're operating in accord with those rules, but they also have to also understand the underlying worldview itself, things like the metaphysics and the ethics and so on, and make sure that they're being true to those sorts of things. I think those are sort of like the baseline. If you're going to do a really quick and dirty, like here's the duties that you have as somebody who's been entrusted with this, aside from just basic, like, know the stuff, it sort of breaks down into that. So this gets us to what Hollywood has been doing. Has Hollywood been doing that? And obviously the answer is no. We have ample examples of Hollywood's tendency in recent years to go ahead and purchase IP and then engage in taxidermy, where they are violating all these things. They're changing essential properties rather than accidental properties. They are inserting their own worldview in violation of the worldview of the author. They are violating the rules of the universe that are there and creating their own, rules. They're adding characters in order to bring diversity or to, bring, femininity or something like that. And in the process, they're creating new characters, new stories, new structures, and so on. In other words, what you're getting is, by the time all is said and done, you no longer have the original thing, right? You have this Buffalo Bill style Hollywood taxidermy, where what you have is just the skin that's still left in order to try to sell tickets. It's part of the branding of it. It's part of the effort to mitigate the financial risk. But the substance of it has been gutted and replaced with something totally different that has no regard for the original material, the goodness of the original material, or concern for their duties as stewards of this very good thing. And a lot of the examples of this, we've already touched on. I mentioned already the MCU, right? The ways in which Marvel, at first, people were thrilled, right? There was I remember when, the first Iron Man came out and people started to see like these superhero portrayals that really sort of felt true to the comic books, and people, it's blowing people's minds. But there came a point, in, like I said, I don't remember if it's is it Marvel phase 4 or whatever it is, phase 3, I don't know. But anyway, there came this point where there was a very clear agenda on the side of Marvel, and they were explicit about it, right? This isn't conjecture. They were explicit about it, right? Like they talked about how, we're going to get to the point where we have more women than men and things like that. And all of a sudden, for people who cared about the IP, it was like, wait, why, right? Like, I'm interested in this because of the IP, right? I'm interested in this because of these characters. I'm interested in this because of this world, right? I'm interested in it because of these stories. What does having more women than men have anything to do with any of that sort of stuff? And the answer is it doesn't, right? It has to do with the fact that this has now become a vehicle for something else that you want to do or say, right? For characters that you want to invent and stories you want to tell that aren't those stories. And that's, again, the Buffalo Bill style sort of stuff. So you definitely saw that in Marvel. Marvel is the obvious example of that. Lord of the Rings, right? I talked about how, with the original Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson was very, faithful to the books and to Tolkien. Like I said, I think there are probably blind spots where he may have diverged from Tolkien, and you could take issue with certain choices that he made. But I think with Jackson, those are honest mistakes. I don't think those are sort of intentionally malicious, like Tolkien be damned, I'm going to do what I want sort of thing. But definitely with Rings of Power, what you started to see a very intentional Tolkien be damned, right? Which is that we're going to take this and we're going to collapse the lore time-wise. We're going to disregard, Tolkien's worldview. We're not even going to bother to really get to know Tolkien's worldview. And we're going to engage in updating and modernizing it. They always talked about for a modern audience, which basically meant we're going to go ahead and gut Tolkien's worldview, which we find antiquated and offensive, and put in our own worldview and our own characters and all this sort of stuff. And so it was very intentionally engaged in that sort of thing. And you saw the same thing more recently with, what is it, War of the Rohirram, I believe it is called. If you haven't heard of it, I don't blame you. Very few people saw it. It was the animated, we're going to do the War of the Rohirram, this thing about the Riders of Rohan. And just sort of like right on the face of it, you could tell the same sort of thing was happening, where it was like our main character is this character Hera, which in Tolkien's world is just sort of a side note. It's not significant, but in this case, like she's the whole shebang, right? And she's this fabricated character, not totally fabricated, right? Like she's the daughter of somebody, and in that sense, she exists in the lore, but we don't even know her name. And so she becomes this fabricated character who's the center of it, and who, like, all the downfalls of all the men are because they don't listen to her, and she's superior to all the men, and all this sort of stuff. Like, it was clearly like this sort of like feminist tale that had nothing to do with Tolkien, right? And something that, quite candidly, Tolkien would probably be deeply offended by, right? He would not actually advocate the form of feminism and the ethics that are there beneath that sort of story. But it wasn't just that, right? Like, there was also a lack of care for the lore itself. So just as a simple thing, which I can't take credit for this, there's actually my producer pointed this out, that Tolkien, the character is actually named Hera, and which is obviously sort of like a Hellenistic name. But Tolkien was much more interested in things like Welsh, and would never actually advocated that name, right? Just on the surface of it, the choice of name already shows, like, you don't know Tolkien's mind or his concern for languages, what he values, what he doesn't, and things like that. And you're just fabricating something. And Tolkien is, again, he's just a vehicle for selling tickets. You want to tell this story, and rather than like letting it sort of succeed on its own merits, what we're going to do is we're going to buy Tolkien's skin, and then we're going to wear it into the movie theater, and try to sell it on that basis. And so that's what you get with like War of the Rohirrim. And obviously I'm expecting the same sort of thing that's going to happen with C.S. Lewis. So I mentioned that with the original Narnia Chronicles movies, I thought there were I'm not a big fan of those. I don't think they're great. But I don't think they're like malicious in that sort of way. But I'm expecting Netflix is pouring a lot of money into redoing the Narnia Chronicles and doing a bunch of C.S. Lewis stuff. And I believe they put Greta Gerwig in charge of it. And so, like, knowing that there is a cosmic difference between Greta's worldview and C.S. Lewis's worldview, and the fact that Greta is very outspoken about her worldview, I have trouble believing that what we're going to get is C.S. Lewis. I think what we're going to get is the skin of C.S. Lewis wrapped up within Greta's ideology and worldview. And it's going to be a worldview that Lewis would be horrified by. That's my suspicion. And we will have to see. I would love to be wrong about that, by the way, but I don't think I'm going to be. And then obviously, another notorious example is also the Star Wars franchise that, part of the challenge here is that Lucas is the first to have ruined his own franchise, but those freaking prequels. So obviously you had the original trilogy, which was groundbreaking in terms of visual effects and cinematic storytelling, the impact on culture, formation of imagination for an entire generation, like myself, was huge, right? It was enormous, right? And then I think, rather than me sort of expounding on it, I think the best way to sort of understand what those prequels did, just watch a documentary called The People versus George Lucas, and that will tell it all. Suffice to say, they weren't good. There's only been like 2 movies I've walked out of the theater during. One was the Clone Wars, and the other one was like the George Clooney Batman with Mr. Freeze. I used to see you. It was bad. It was really bad. Like, Lucas ruined my childhood retroactively with that. Anyway, but yeah, and so and then obviously Lucas went ahead after he, did that abomination. He went ahead and sold it, that trilogy of abominations. He went ahead and sold it to Disney, who proceeded to just like further defile the corpse that Lucas handed over. It was probably still warm, maybe. I don't know. anyway, I don't know how you want to play out that metaphor, but this is actually an interesting one, which is, the Lucas one in Star Wars raises this sort of intriguing aside about whether the artist has their own sort of obligations to the IP, as well as actually whether or not the artist has full control over the art. And I don't want to, I think there's something very interesting here. Han shot first. You familiar with that? So one of the things, I don't know if you remember, depending on who you are in the audience or how much you've followed this, before they did the prequels, Lucas re-released in theaters. I remember this. I was in Baltimore at the time at art school. They re-released in the theaters the original trilogy. Now, Lucas what he had done is he actually dusted off some old footage that they weren't able to use in the original ones. Like, for example, Jabba the Hutt. He had always intended on showing Jabba the Hutt before Return of the Jedi, and they had even shot it with a guy who was a stand-in, but they didn't have a way to sort of swap him out for Jabba, and so they dusted off that footage, and now they put in a CGI Jabba, and they could reuse that and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, and so Lucas re-released those, and there was a lot of sort of discontent. I mean, on the one hand, people lost their minds. It was we finally get to go back to the movie theaters and see these things that were released and formative on our childhood. But there were two things that were a certain amount of discontent, which I do think actually indicated that Lucas had violated his own art. He was the first to actually defile it. And what I mean by this is the one thing was that it was Lucas had been completely enamored with CGI. He thought oh, this is going to be the future. We're not going to use real actors, all this sort of stuff. He was he was one of the first to be let's shoot it not on film, but let's shoot it digitally, all that sort of stuff. But with that, it was he was able to finally go back and say now I can I can soup up my visual effects. I can make things more the way I envision them than I did back then. And there was a real disservice here to the visual effects artists. I mean, there's some there's one of the channels I follow on YouTube is visual effects artists react, where you have professional VFX artists who watch different sort of effects and they react, and their examination of the Star Wars one is fascinating because their minds are just blown by the sort of innovation that you had to use in order to do the types of visual effects you did back then when you didn't have computers to execute it, right? That you had to actually do double exposure and all this sort of stuff. And those effects artists, they won Academy Awards, and rightly so. They were so innovative with regard to visual effects, and Lucas just made their stuff disappear. And that actually is, I think, that is just going ahead and taking a sledgehammer and knocking the arm off of the Pieta. So I think that's actually something that Lewis did that was wrong. It was immoral. The other thing that I think is notable is the way in which I mentioned Han shot first. So in the original Star Wars, when you first meet Han Solo, who is this marauder, smuggler guy, he is confronted by, in the cantina, right, this bar, you have Guido, I believe is his name, right, this sort of weird alien, lizardy type thing, who comes up and he confronts Han, and I think it's because maybe there's a bounty out on him or something like that, and he's holding him at gunpoint and so on. And in the original film, Han unbuckles his laser gun at his on his leg, and then he secretly shoots Guido under the table, and he drops dead. And from a story perspective, this told you a lot about Han, right? It told you that he's a cutthroat, right? It told you that he's, part of this sort of seedy underbelly. The very fact that the cantina, everybody looks and then they go back to playing and doing stuff, tells you something about the shady place that they're in, right? This sort of place where people get shot and it's no big deal, or arms get cut off, right? Things like that. And so, and George Lucas, in the re-release, he did this weird thing where he had Guido shoot. He added this laser, and then he did this weird wonky digital effect where like Han dodges. It's not in the original thing. It looks so goofy. And he hits the wall, and then he shoots him. And a lot of fans were pissed, and they were pissed because they're like, that changes Han Solo. That's a different character. You just changed his, like, what sort of character Han is. And so there were like shirts that said like Han shot first. And that matters. And I do think there's a real sense in which I actually am of the mind that once something has been crafted and constructed in that sort of way, the artist does not have the ability to sort of retroactively do a revisionist history of what's there. Like, again, legally they can go back and do that. But once you've formed a story, anybody who's engaged in storytelling and writing and things like that, you recognize that these characters take on a certain shape. And there is, in this character, things they would and they wouldn't do, unless you're doing these sort of like bad writing cardboard cutout where they do whatever you need them to do whenever you need them to do it. I talked about that problem in bad writing in the Mary episode, the Netflix Mary episode. But, like when you're actually doing a fully orbed character, these characters are substantive, right? If you've done your job well, certain things they would do and they wouldn't do. And so I don't think once you've formed a world and you've sort of put it out there as a cohesive whole, that you as the artist have this sort of freedom to just go back and retroactively just say certain things about the material. I think there actually has been a story told and characters formed. And so I think it's a legitimate complaint to say Han is not, Han shoots first. Like, that's who he is. And Lucas has in some ways violated, the story, the structure that was there and all that when doing that sort of thing. I think it's similar when, and I'm not an expert on Harry Potter, but right, like I know that there was all this controversy because J.K. Rowling had said like, well, Dumbledore's gay. And part of the question that I would have, and it's more of a question because I'm not an expert, but there are certain characters that like, aren't gay, right? Like there are certain characters that when you write them, you can't just sort of like go back after the fact and say, well, we need a gay character. So like spin the wheel. Okay. Bob. Yeah. Bob was gay, right? Like, no, like Bob, if he's been a properly formed, a fully orbed character, then he's either gay or he's not. Right. And I think there's a real question of whether or not Dumbledore really was gay. Like, is that something that in J.K. Rowling's formation of him and in the character and how he's like sort of written and formed in the original books, is that true? Or is that a retrograde? Like, yeah, I'm going to make it, I'm going to make something that's controversial or fashionable or whatever. And I just retroactively declare that he's gay. I think it's possible that you could have an author after the fact for political reasons or social reasons or whatever, declare this character was gay, and that would be false. And what I mean by false is that's not the character they wrote. And just because they declare it, it doesn't make it by fiat actually true to the original source material. So similar to Han Solo, right? Han shot first. But of course, Lucas did the diabolical thing of he like took his digital paintbrush and painted over everything. And then he like took away the original so that you can't get them anymore. At least that's my understanding. Can you get them anymore? Anyway, so there you go. But that's okay. So that's an interesting aside. Just wanted to make that aside about like the limitations of the author. And in some sense, their duties to this goes to their sort of own duties and obligations to their own source material in terms of how they steward it and whatnot. Now, I do want to make one more point here before I wrap up. And that point is the permissibility of knockoffs. So if you go and you listen to the cultural appropriation episode, one of the things that I talk about there is that when you're talking about this sort of relational property and ownership and things like that, that goes to the particular, not to the generic. So let's say, I can't remember exactly which example I use, but let's just use something I've already talked about, glaze painting, right? This very sort of like this classical technique where you paint and you use layers and layers and thin layers and layers, and the translucent, colors, layers end up creating this very cool sort of, ethereal effect and so on. Okay, so let's just pretend that I'm the first guy who came up with glaze painting, right? And I do a series of paintings like this, and then I have an art show, and people are fascinated, and they're like, "Whoa, how did you do that?" And then, I release a YouTube channel, and people see how I did it, and then other people start to do it. There is no theft happening in somebody observing my technique and then appropriating it for themselves, right? There's a difference between the particular artifact, right? The object itself that I produce. And I might be credited with the first to come up with this technique, but I don't own the technique, right? The generic sort of technique itself, I don't own. I own the artifact, right? That's mine. But the technique that I utilize and express there is something that any other rational being could observe, learn from, appropriate, develop in their own ways, and so on. And I think that's really important, because what this goes to is that it's completely morally permissible to look at Tolkien. Let's say something like, you look at Tolkien and you're like, that's brilliant, but I totally disagree with Tolkien's worldview. I am a third wave feminist, or I am, a utilitarian. I am a metaphysical dualist, right? Pick your poison, whatever it is that you want to disagree with Tolkien about. Like, I disagree with Tolkien about this and about this and about this and about this. And so I think his worldview is all wrong, but I can't deny that he's created a compelling world. And I really love this whole fantasy genre and so on. It would not be immoral. It would not be wrong. It would actually be totally appropriate for you to go ahead and learn from Tolkien. So you sit there and you examine his story writing structure. You try to examine and abstract, well, what are the principles of this storytelling that are so brilliant? Like, what makes it compelling? And you start to learn from that. So you start to say, well, part of it is the depth of the world itself. Part of it is the language and the geography and the peoples. Part of it is the archetypes that are being used, et cetera, right? And you get your catalog. And then you go ahead and you're like, well, I'm going to do my own alternative to Tolkien, and I'm going to build my own world, and I'm going to build my own characters. And then I'm going to tell a story. And in my story, the underlying worldview is going to reflect my worldview. So it's going to be metaphysical dualism here and not a privation theory of evil. And there are going to be third wave feminists in here. And they are going to be praised as heroes because third wave feminism, I actually think, is true. And in this world, it is true, right? And that's going to come through and, whatever. There would be nothing actually wrong with that. The immorality, that comes through in Hollywood is not the idea that they look at Tolkien and they say, that's great, we could really make a heck of a movie out of that. The problem is that they look at Tolkien and say, he has a fan base who loves him. We're going to buy that fan base. So we're going to buy that fan base by basically buying his skin, but we're going to stuff it with something else. That's the Trojan horse, right? That's the thing where what's happening is you're actually violating the thing that you've purchased, right? You're killing it, right? You're gutting it. You're getting rid of the goods of it. You're turning it into something else, and then you're selling a false bill of goods. So if what you want to do is you want to sell Tolkien, then you need to do the sorts of things that I talked about. You need to buy Tolkien. You need to understand the worldview. You need to understand the accidental versus essential properties, et cetera, right? Like all of that sort of stuff that we talked about. But if you just think Tolkien is cool, right, but you disagree with his worldview, then the moral thing to do, if you're going to tell your alternative story morally, then the moral thing to do is actually to just make your own story. That's what you should do, right? Then just take the archetypes that you see there in Tolkien and come up with your own characters. Build your own nicely nuanced layer and use your own worldview rather than his worldview. But why doesn't Hollywood do that? Well, Hollywood doesn't do that because they want the financial risk. They want your ticket, you who like Tolkien. And so it's too risky to build my own world like Tolkien and risk that it fails because maybe it's not as good as Tolkien. But if I can buy Tolkien's carcass, maybe I can still also get your ticket. And that's where you get into the immorality of that entire endeavor. So here's to hoping that something will change in the future, and the outraged fans about all this IP and lowly voices like mine may one day break through, and we might actually get storytellers who start to actually be good stewards of the intellectual property that they get behind. That's the hope, anyway. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.